The sound of water had always been my peace. Every morning before the world woke up, I'd sit on the edge of my dock, coffee steaming in my hands. Watching the sun rise over the calm glass of my lake, it wasn't just water to me, it was where my kids learned to swim, where my late wife used to fish barefoot with me at dusk, where my father taught me how to skip stones and told me to never let greedy men take what you love. I never thought those words would come back to haunt me so sharply. But they did hurt. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA. At first, I didn't even think they had anything to do with my property. My ranch and lake sat at the very edge of the community, separated from their neatly trimmed lawns and HOA rules by a stretch of woodland. I opened the letter casually, expecting some nonsense about upcoming community events or maybe a request for a donation. Instead, was a notice of land reassignment for community benefit. My lakefront, my dock, my shoreline. According to them, it was going to be repurposed to build 120 luxury vacation cabins to increase HOA revenue. I sat there at my kitchen table, reading those words over and over. My chest tightened. Oh, surely this was a mistake. Surely they didn't think they could just take it. I drove down to the HOA office the very next morning. The air was thick and humid, storm clouds brewing, which matched the mood boiling inside me. The president, a woman named Linda Carver, met me with that fake customer service smile people use when they're about to ruin your day but want to make it sound like they're helping. "Oh, Mr. Rains," she said, folding her manicured hands, like she was some kind of saint. "We've been meaning to discuss this with you. See, the lake is considered part of the community under certain easements, and we've determined that developing it will benefit all residents." Benefit all residents. I snapped. I've lived here 22 years. That lake has been my family's life. And you think building overpriced cabins for tourists is a benefit? Her smile didn't even flicker. "You'll be compensated fairly. We've already scheduled groundbreaking for next month." I left before I did something I'd regret, but my hands were shaking the whole drive home. That night, I sat on my porch, staring out over the water, trying to think of what my father would say if he were still alive. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw bulldozers tearing up the shoreline where my kids used to play. A week later, they brought in surveyors. They didn't even have the decency to knock first. They just showed up in reflective vests, walking around with clipboards and pointing at the water like they already owned it. I told them to get off my land, but one of them just shrugged and said, "Talk to the HOA. We're just doing our job." By the end of the month, signs went up. Future site of lakeshore luxury cabins. It felt like a slap in the face. My neighbors whispered about how exciting the project was, how property values would go up. I started feeling like a stranger in my own home. Then came the day they brought in the heavy machinery. I stood there, helpless, as they began, clearing trees near the waterline. I could smell the gasoline and hear the chainsaws buzzing through decades-old oaks. I wanted to scream, but there was a lump in my throat the size of a fist. That night, I walked down to the dam. My father and I had rebuilt it years ago when the old one was falling apart. The HOA never even paid attention to it. They didn't know the dam wasn't part of their community property. It was on my land, under my control, and without it, there was no lake. Just a muddy basin. The thought scared me at first. Draining. The lake would destroy everything I loved about it. But the more I thought about those cabins, the more my fear turned into something else, something hotter, sharper. I wasn't going to let them steal my lakefront. If they wanted cabins, they could have them, standing in the middle of a dried-up pit. But revenge takes planning and patience. And I had both. I spent the next week in a haze, torn between grief for what they'd already taken and the fire building in my chest to take it all back. Every time I passed one of those survey stakes in the ground, bright orange ribbons fluttering in the wind, it felt like a taunt. I knew if I acted too soon, they'd figure out a way to stop me. I had to wait for the perfect moment when their investment was deep enough that losing it would hurt the most. At night, I'd sit in my father's old workshop, staring at the weathered blueprint of the dam we'd built. My hands would trace over the penciled lines where he'd written notes in the margins, things like reinforce here and check spillway before flood season. I could almost hear his voice. Steady and certain. A man's land is his legacy. You guard it like you'd guard your family. That voice followed me everywhere. Even when I was buying groceries, I'd catch myself gripping the cart handle tighter, thinking about the HOA's bulldozers chewing up the shore. Then came the town meeting. It wasn't even called to discuss the cabins, but the HOA had worked it into the agenda like it was just another piece of business. Linda Carver stood there, smiling like a politician, going on about community growth and attracting tourism. I raised my hand to speak, but she cut me off with that sugary tone. Mr. Rains, we appreciate your concern, but your portion of the lakefront falls under our easement rights. The decision is final. A few people clapped. Others avoided my eyes. I left before the meeting was over, because if I'd stayed, I would have told them what I was really thinking. That would have given everything away. 2 days later, real construction began. Piles of lumber were dropped off. Foundations were staked out. I stood in the shadows of my porch, watching them. My jaw clenched so tight it ached. My lake was no longer quiet in the mornings. Now it was filled with the sound of nail guns, shouting, and the grinding of machinery. But while they worked in the open, I worked in secret. The dam was hidden a quarter-mile from the development site, tucked behind a curtain of willows. Most folks didn't even know it existed when you looked at the lake. It just seemed endless. That was my advantage. The HOA thought the water level was some permanent feature of nature. They didn't realize one crank of a steel gate could change everything. I started with maintenance. At night, I'd slip down to the dam with a flashlight, oiling the mechanisms, checking the release gates, clearing away debris. It felt strange, like I was preparing a weapon, one my father had unknowingly built with me years ago. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If they wanted to take from me, I'd give them exactly what they wanted, just not in the way they expected. They could pour all their money into those cabins, decorate them with fancy furniture, hang their lake view signs. And then, one day, that view would be nothing but cracked mud and the stench of rotting fish. Still, there was a part of me that hesitated. This wasn't just about punishing the HOA. It would hurt the land itself. Draining the lake would kill the fish, ruin the wildlife habitat. But then I'd remember Linda's smug smile, the sound of chainsaws ripping into trees that had stood for 100 years. They'd already disrespected the land. I wasn't destroying it. I was taking back control. The breaking point came one afternoon when I found a group of tourists already standing on my dock. They were snapping pictures like it was some public park. When I told them it was private property, one man laughed and said, "Not for long, buddy, or this is going to be the hot new vacation spot." Something inside me snapped. I didn't argue. I just walked away, my pulse pounding in my ears. That night, I stood at the dam, staring at the release wheel. The metal was cold under my palm, the smell of the lake rising in the night air. Didn't turn it, not yet. But I knew then that it was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. The lake had been my sanctuary for so long that the idea of turning it into my weapon felt unnatural. But the more I watched the HOA hammer their way into my world, the easier it became to imagine. By now, the skeletons of the first cabins were already up, wood frames standing like arrogant intruders against the skyline. The once quiet mornings were filled with shouting workers and the constant echo of machinery. It was like my home had been swallowed by someone else's dream and I was choking on it. Every day, I played the part of the beaten man. I'd wave half-heartedly at the workers, keep my head down, even let the HOA think they'd won me over. But inside, I was cataloging every delivery truck, every load of materials, every progress milestone. I wanted them fully committed. I wanted them so deep in their project that when I pulled the trigger, they wouldn't just lose, they'd collapse. I kept my visits to the damn secret. Sometimes I'd go just before dawn, sometimes after midnight. I'd check the sluice gates, test the chain, make sure the gears turned smoothly. I also started marking water levels on the inside wall with chalk. I needed to know exactly how much to release and how fast, if I wanted to drop the lake without causing a dangerous flood downstream. My father always said the dam was a living thing, you had to treat it with respect. Even now, in my anger, I knew he'd want me to be careful. But the HOA wasn't careful with anything. One afternoon, I caught Linda Carver herself on my shoreline, clipboard in hand, pointing out where they planned to put a community fishing dock. She didn't even look embarrassed when she saw me. "Mr. Rains," she said like she was greeting an old friend, "you're going to love this. We're keeping the dock and the plans. Imagine how nice it'll be for everyone to enjoy it." I laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that doesn't come from humor. It comes from the part of you that's already broken. "It's my dock, Linda." Her expression didn't change. Not for long. I turned and walked away before my mouth got me into trouble. But that was the moment I stopped hesitating. No more doubts. No more maybe I shouldn't. I began preparing for the day. The first step was clearing out my own valuables. Anything I didn't want damaged or swept away if the shoreline shifted. I moved to higher ground. My fishing gear, the boat, the old wooden bench my wife and I used to sit on during sunset sit, all went up to the shed near the road. I told neighbors I was just doing some tidying. If they suspected anything, they didn't say it. The second step was patience. I waited as the cabins went from bare frames to real structures. Walls went up, roofs went on, porches were built, with wide glass doors facing the water. Every nail they drove in felt like one more reason to see this through. By the end of the month, the marketing-starred HOA newsletters boasted about exclusive lakefront rentals coming soon. I even spotted glossy brochures with pictures of my lake, my trees, my sky claimed as theirs. And then, the perfect opportunity fell into my lap. A massive storm rolled in, drenching the area for 2 days straight. The lake swelled high against the dam, the water restless, pushing at the gates. It was dangerous, yes, but it also meant I could drop the water fast without anyone realizing it was my doing. They'd think it was nature, bad luck, an act of God. The night the rain stopped, I walked down to the dam under a moonless sky. The path was slick with mud, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist rising off the water. My boots splashed in shallow puddles as I reached the steel wheel. My hands trembled not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what I was about to do. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal and took a deep breath. I thought of my kids, my wife, my father, and then I thought of Linda's smug smile, of the tourists standing on my dock, of the chainsaws tearing through my trees. I began to turn the wheel. The creak of the gate echoed in the night as water surged through the spillway, roaring into the channel below. I worked slowly at first, then faster, feeling the current grow stronger. The sound was deafening, like the earth itself was exhaling. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was the point of no return. By morning, the lake already looked different. The waterline had retreated several feet from the shore, leaving a muddy fringe where the waves used to kiss the grass. Birds circled overhead, confused, their cries sharp in the still, damp air. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, watching. The slow unveiling of the lakebed. It was both painful and strangely satisfying. Around mid-morning, I heard the first shouts. The construction crew had arrived, expecting to keep working like nothing was wrong. But instead of their usual clanging and hammering, there was an uneasy quiet broken by bursts of disbelief. From where I stood, I could see them walking out toward the shore, gesturing wildly. Pointing at the exposed mud, I could almost read their lips. What happened? Where's the water going? By noon, word had spread through the community like wildfire. Trucks came and went. People clustered in small groups, staring at the shrinking lake. Linda Carver showed up in her shiny black SUV, storming across the half-finished cabins in her designer boots. She looked like she was ready to chew someone's head off. I stayed on my porch, watching through binoculars as she barked orders, her face flushing red. The thing about draining a lake slowly is that it creeps up on you. At first, you tell yourself it's just a little low. Then it's a couple more feet, then several more, until suddenly it's undeniable. By the third day, the cabin's lake view was nothing but a widening expanse of cracked earth. The fish were gone, the waterfowl had moved on, and the smell of damp, exposed mud filled the air. That smell, that was when people started to get angry. I overheard neighbors complaining at the grocery store, their voices low but heated. "We paid extra for this neighborhood because of the lake," one woman said. "Now it's gone. Just gone." Another man muttered something about demanding the HOA fix it immediately. Linda, of course, was scrambling. They brought in so-called lake management experts who tried to claim it was an unusual drought. But anyone with eyes could see the truth: it had rained heavily just last week. They had no explanation that made sense. I stayed quiet. Whenever someone asked my opinion, I just shook my head and said, "Strange times." Inside, though, I felt the knot in my chest start to loosen, but it wasn't all easy. One evening, my daughter called from out of state. She'd seen pictures online. Someone had posted a photo of the half-drained lake, the sad shoreline. "Dad, what happened?" "That place was our childhood," she said, her voice heavy with hurt. I hesitated. I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. "It's the HOA's mess," I said finally. "They wanted to change everything. Looks like they've got more change than they bargained for." There was a pause on the other end. I hope you're okay," she said quietly. That was the part that stung. She could hear something in my voice I didn't mean to show. Meanwhile, the HOA's problems were snowballing. Investors who had fronted money for the cabin project were starting to panic. Without the lake, their luxury waterfront rentals were worthless. Work on the cabins slowed, then stopped entirely as disputes broke out over funding. I'd pass by some mornings and see workers standing around with their arms crossed, waiting for orders that never came. By the end of the second week, the lake was down to a shallow, stagnant pool at the center. The once blue water had turned a murky green, swarmed by insects. The air smelled sour. The glossy brochures that had boasted breathtaking lakeside views were now a cruel joke. One afternoon, as I was checking the fence line, Linda pulled up beside me in her SUV. She rolled down the window, her voice tight with forced politeness. "Mr. Rains," she said, "you've lived here longer than anyone. Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" I kept my face still, like stone. "I guess the lake just decided it didn't like being part of your plan." Her eyes narrowed. She wanted to push, I could tell, but she didn't have proof. Not yet. She drove away without another word. That night, I walked down to the dam again. The water level was lower than I'd ever seen it, the moonlight glinting off the exposed stone. I turned the wheel another quarter turn, feeling the pull in my arms as the current surged again. The roar filled the night, a steady rush that seemed to carry my anger with it. The next morning, the lake was barely recognizable, and the HOA, they were standing on the edge of their grand dream, watching it crumble into dust. And I was just getting started. By the start of the third week, the lake was almost gone. What remained was a shallow, grimy puddle in the middle, surrounded by mud so soft you'd sink if you tried to cross it. The air was thick with the stench of rotting fish, the once peaceful sound of lapping water replaced by the distant buzz of flies. The cabins, now half-finished, stood like abandoned skeletons, useless monuments to greed. From my porch, I watched the HOA unravel in real time. The morning meetings they used to hold at their fancy community center were now heated, arguments spilling out into the parking lot. I could hear them from my property, voices raised, accusations flying. Investors were threatening lawsuits. Contractors were demanding payment. And residents, well, they were starting to see through the glossy lies Linda had been selling. The first real fracture came when a group of homeowners called an emergency vote to dissolve the cabin project entirely. I went purely to watch the show. The meeting room was overflowing, the air thick with tension. Linda stood at the front, trying to maintain control, but she looked different, now drawn, pale, perfect composure cracking around the edges. "Please, everyone, this is just a temporary setback," she said, flipping through charts and expert reports about possible lake restoration. "We believe that drop in water levels is reversible, and we are taking immediate action to restore the lake." Reversible. A man in the back barked. "It's a swamp. You sold us on lakefront living, and now we've got mosquitoes the size of bats." The room erupted in shouting. Some people blamed Linda directly. Others muttered about sabotage, though no one could agree on who might have done it. I kept my mouth shut, sitting in the corner with my arms crossed, enjoying the storm. But the personal blow came a few days later. I got a letter hand-delivered, not mailed. No HOA logo, no formal language. Just a single sheet of paper, handwritten, with one line, "You're going to regret this." No signature. No explanation. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at those words, the paper trembling in my hand. It was obvious someone suspected me. Maybe they'd seen me near the dam one night. Maybe they'd just put the pieces together. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of unease. They pushed hard enough, they might be able to connect me to the drop in water levels. But then I reminded myself the dam was mine. Legally, every bolt, every plank, every inch of it sat on my property. I didn't owe them a drop of water still. The note made things feel different. This wasn't just about the lake anymore. Someone in that HOA was willing to threaten me. That made it personal, and that made me more dangerous. That night, I went to the dam again, but not to open it further. I just stood there, listening to the reduced flow of water in the darkness. The moon was high, casting silver light over the drying basin. I thought about my father again, how he'd built this with his bare hands, how he'd trusted me to protect it. And then I thought about the strangers who had come onto my land, called it theirs, and tried to erase my family's history for the sake of profit. The next day, I upped the pressure. I started making calls to the local press, to environmental groups, to anyone who might have an interest in the mysterious loss of our lake. I made sure they knew about the HOA's plans for the cabins, how they were tearing into sensitive shoreline habitats, how it all seemed suspiciously connected to the sudden disappearance of the water. The first article hit 2 days later. The headline read, "Luxury Development in Trouble as Lake Vanishes." It was beautiful. The story spread quickly, picked up by regional news stations. Footage of the cracked, empty lakebed and the half-finished cabins ran alongside interviews with furious residents. Linda was cornered into giving a statement, fumbling through vague promises to restore the natural beauty of the area. Meanwhile, I was left alone, No one dared to knock on my door, and the anonymous notes stopped. But I could feel their eyes on me whenever I drove into town. Some looked suspicious. Others, I think, looked grateful. Because here's the thing about revenge, it's contagious. Once people see someone stand up to a bully, they start finding their own courage by the end of that week. Several residents had filed formal complaints against the HOA board. A few even threatened to sue. The once solid foundation of their little empire was crumbling, and I was right there to watch the bricks fall. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. By the start of the fourth week, the HOA was in open freefall. The cabins were abandoned, their skeletal frames left to bake in the summer sun, wood already warping from the lack of shade. What was once a construction site, buzzing with activity, had turned into a ghost town. The sound of hammers and saws was gone, replaced by the soft, eerie hum of wind across empty structures. I heard through the grapevine that 2 of the investors had already pulled their funding. Without the promise of a lake, the luxury part of the cabins was a joke, and the projected rental income collapsed. The HOA's budget, which had been dangerously stretched to begin with, was now bleeding out faster than they could patch. Linda Carver was no longer strutting around in her polished heels. I saw her once that week, driving past in her SUV, phone pressed to her ear, hair unkempt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like a woman who'd been awake for days. The community was splitting into factions. On one side were the loyalists, the ones still clinging to the idea that the cabins could somehow be saved, that the lake could magically come back. On the other were the furious homeowners who realized their HOA fees had been poured into a sinking ship. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Neighbors stopped speaking to each other. You could feel the tension in the air like static before a lightning strike. I kept my head down, but I didn't disappear. I made sure I was seen. Doing normal things, mowing my lawn, fixing my fence, walking down to the store. Every now and then, someone would give me a look, a small nod, like they knew but weren't going to say anything. Maybe they thought I was just the man who refused to bow to the HOA. Maybe they admired it. Either way, no one came to challenge me directly. Then came the day the county inspectors showed up. I was on my porch when I saw their trucks roll past. Bright yellow county seals on the doors. They weren't there for me, they were headed straight for the cabins. I grabbed my binoculars and watched from a distance as they walked the property, taking notes, pointing at structures, shaking their heads. Word spread fast. The county had flagged the project for multiple violations, improper permits, failure to meet environmental regulations, and a laundry list of safety concerns. Without the lake, the development's original permits were void, and they'd need to start the entire approval process from scratch if they ever wanted to continue. It was the nail in the coffin that night. I sat by what was left of the water. Shallow, dark pool that reflected the stars like broken glass. It hurt to see it this way. This was never about destroying the lake. It was about stopping the people who thought they could own it. My father's voice echoed in my head again, telling me land is a legacy. I had kept mine safe, but at a cost. Still. The quiet was back. No machinery, no shouting. Just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. I felt something I hadn't in weeks' peace. The following day, the HOA called an urgent community meeting. Curiosity got the better of me, so I went. The room was packed, faces drawn tight with anger and stress. Linda stood at the front, her usual poise gone. It is with deep regret. She began, voice cracking, that I inform you, the lakeshore cabin project has been officially terminated. There was no applause, just silence. People glanced at each other, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Then came the kicker. Due to the financial losses incurred, the HOA will be increasing annual dues by 20% effective immediately. The room erupted. People shouted over each other, some threatening lawsuits, others calling for the entire board to resign. Linda tried to regain control, but it was useless. The mob had turned on her. I didn't stay for the rest. I slipped out the side door, the noise fading behind me. Walking home under the starlit sky, I realized I'd done exactly what I set out to do. The HOA wasn't just bleeding money yet, was bleeding trust. Their empire was crumbling from the inside. But I still had one last move to make. I woke before sunrise the next morning. The sky painted in soft purples and golds. The air cool with that crispness only a lake morning used to have. The difference now was the silence, no construction noise, no thrum of machinery, no trucks rumbling down the road, just stillness. It felt like the land was holding its breath. For weeks, I'd kept the dam's gates open just enough to slowly drain the lake, ensuring no one could tie the sudden change to a single moment. But now, with the cabin project dead and the HOA reeling, it was time to end it on my terms. I walked the familiar path to the dam, my boots crunching over dried leaves and twigs. The willow trees swayed gently above me, the same willows that had hidden this place for decades. My father's handiwork was everywhere, the careful joinery of the timber, the stonework he'd laid by hand. It had survived storms, floods, and time itself. And it had survived this war. I closed the gates slowly, listening to the groan of the metal, the hiss of water slowing to a trickle. The lake would refill naturally over time, fed by the streams that wound down from the hills. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen. And when it did, it would belong to me again, untouched, unclaimed by anyone else. By mid-morning, I heard the news spreading like wildfire. Linda Carver had resigned, citing health reasons. The rest of the HOA board announced they'd be stepping down at the next election. The financial reports leaked they'd burned through nearly all the HOA's reserves on the cabin project, with nothing to show for it but debts and lawsuits. I should have felt triumphant. And I did, but there was something deeper than triumph. There was relief. That afternoon, I took my old fishing chair down to the muddy edge of what remained of the lake. The ground was soft and smelled of earth and renewal. I cracked open a beer and sat there, looking out at the shallow water glinting in the sun. This place was scarred. But so was I, and scars don't mean you're broken, they mean you've healed stronger than before. As I sat there, a couple walked past on the trail that curved around the far side. They gave me a small wave, and the man called out, glad to see it's quiet again. I just smiled and nodded. That night, as the stars came out, I thought of my father, my wife, my kids. The lake had been part of all of us, woven into our memories. The HOA thought they could buy it, own it, reshape it into something it was never meant to be. But they didn't understand they weren't just stealing water. They were trying to steal history. And history doesn't belong to them. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest sound of water flowing back into the basin. It would take weeks, maybe months, for the lake to come alive again. But it would. It always had. I leaned back in my chair, let the sound of the breeze fill my ears, and smiled. Justice wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was patient. It was watching the sun rise over a lake that still belonged to you, knowing no one could ever take it again. And in that moment, I knew I'd won.